President President, what was the other name that he got? President Trump has directed the Labor Department to review, that's a euphemism for get rid of, an Obama administration rule requiring financial advisors to observe what's called the fiduciary rule. Now, I understand if you saw this in the newspaper, your eyes would glaze over and you'd reach for another cookie because it sounds as exciting as last year's oatmeal. So let me explain to you why it is exciting. Once upon a time, Americans had pensions. We outgrew that, so we don't have them very much. But those of us who still have them notice that they changed over the last 20 years. They used to be what are called defined benefit pensions. Basically, you put some money away, or your employer did every week, and that got you a certain benefit when you reached 65 or retirement age. You knew you would get X dollars a month to take care of you. This the companies didn't like because it would really squeeze them, because if they put that money into an investment and the investment didn't go real well, they still had to pay you. So they wanted to have it changed. This was considered something that would give Americans freedom. When someone is going to give you freedom, hold on to your wallet because something is going to happen that's uncomfortable soon. So anyway, freedom meant the employer shouldn't have your money while you wait for it to retire. You should have the money. You should be free, there we go, to have that money. So what they did is they changed the pensions, so they're no longer defined benefit, you get a certain amount. Instead, it's called a defined contribution. In other words, every week, your employer takes out a little bit of money and contributes that amount, defined contribution, into a fund for you, and you become free to manage it. And in that freedom, you discover a hustle, if you're awake. Here's the hustle. You're not an investment specialist. You don't know how to do this. No one has ever told you how to do it. So you do what you normally do, like when your car doesn't work, you go to the mechanic, and there's a part of you that understands that you've just turned over something very valuable to a person who is inside laughing their head off because they can do almost anything and you're stuck. Well, an investment advisor is the mechanic of your finances. You're giving him the money, or her, but it's mostly men, giving them the money, and they invest it. They tell you what you should be doing. You should have this stock, you should have this mutual fund, you should have this government security, whatever it is they tell you. And there's loads of them. It's a huge industry. Okay, now here comes the fiduciary rule. It turns out, and believe me, there are Americans who didn't know this before. So this is going to come as a shock to some of you. It turns out that the advisor to you about how to invest your money may not always give you the best advice for you. He may give you the best advice for him. Because it turns out on this security, he gets 12 cents for every share you buy. On that security, he gets $4. This gives him an incentive, that's how markets work, an incentive to tell you not to buy the one where he gets 12 cents, but to buy the one where he gets $4. Even though what's better for you in your situation is to get the one for 12 cents. The fiduciary rule slowly produced over the last 6 years under the Obama administration had the following stunning idea. We would be able, you and I, to go into court and have a legal case against an advisor if we could show that the advisor put his interest as an advisor ahead of our interest as the client of the advisor. That's the fiduciary rule, that when he invests our money, it should be best for us. Radical breakthrough. Mr. Trump is getting rid of that. Okay? What that does is it means that tens of millions of Americans who are waiting to retire or having money withheld from their check every month or every week are going to be making investment decisions without an advisor who is required by law to do what's best for them. They're instead being put into whatever instrument is best for him. And if I had more time, I don't, I would stop now, and as I often say, I would play the national anthem for 4 or 5 minutes just to make everyone feel better. Next item, a success. House of Representatives Bill number 621, introduced into the House of Representatives some weeks or months ago by Representative Jason Chaffetz, C-H-A-F-F-E-T-Z, a representative in Congress from the great state of Utah. That was humor, what I just did. His bill would have the government sell 3 million acres of government-owned land. Because, of course, if the government owns something, it's bad, and if it's sold to the private, it's good. This is a major debate in economics, and it's a little bit in economics sort of like the debate, God is good, and the devil not so much. So government is bad, and the private is good, and Mr. Chaffetz, who comes from a very religious place, is clear about the bad government should sell the land to the private owners. Led by the Wilderness Society, one of these organizations, they mounted an enormous and ferocious campaign, and Mr. Chaffetz withdrew his bill this last week, and so that sale will not go through. I mention that because it does work sometimes if people do something about these things. As you know, one of the things that we do is talk about the need to change the economic system. We do not shy away from being critical of capitalism as a system. We're doing that more and more. And the interesting thing is the audience for it is growing a great deal. This last week, there was a sign of it in a peculiar way, so I wanted to begin with that. Last spring, an institution at Harvard University called the Institute of Politics, which is located at the John F. Kennedy School of Government, that's purely coincidental. It's not an intentional kind of activity. They did a poll of Americans, random poll of Americans 18 to 29 years of age last spring, and they found that a majority of Americans in that age group, 18 to 29, don't like capitalism. Let me say this to you again. A majority, that's more than 50%. If you remember high school, 50 to 50%, it's more than 50%. They don't like capitalism. And that led a young man by the name of, I want to make sure I get this right, I believe it's Trevor Hill, to ask a question this last week in a public hearing of a very important politician who was sitting there and giving a talk. The politician's name was Nancy Pelosi, the head of the House of Representatives, the Democratic leader of the House of Representatives. And he quoted her the statistics from the Harvard poll. And he said it was his hope, and he would like her comment, that the Democratic Party was taking cognizance of this fact, that as the older people, etc., the younger people replaced them, and the younger people clearly are not fans of capitalism anymore. And would she be okay with the Democratic Party accommodating that change in its base? She looked, I actually watched because I wanted to report this to you probably, she looked visibly uncomfortable with the question. You could see in her face she really wished he hadn't asked it. Very nice young man who was very personable and made a good impression. So in her discomfort, she hemmed and hawed a little bit and then said, as if it were the most normal, natural thing in the world, but we're all capitalists. The Democratic Party is capitalist. She made it very clear. And then she went on to talk about other things. I want to stress to you all that the world is changing, and fast, about capitalism. It is not going to get much reporting in the press because the press is owned and operated by people who are not happy about this development, to say the least. And being unhappy about it, they're not going to spend a lot of time giving you detailed discussion of it. They are distressed by the poll at Harvard, not pleased. And one of the ways they can squelch this is by not reporting very much about it, which is why, in part, I'm telling you about it. And it also means that the leaders who read the same papers and watch the same TV the rest of us do are not prepared, like Mrs. Pelosi wasn't, for such a question. Didn't have a good answer, hardly had an answer at all. Well, then what does all of this mean? Well, if you read the poll at Harvard a little further, it turns out that 75% of American young people don't like capitalism, but they don't like the label socialist either. So their anti-capitalism really is about the system they know, which they don't like, but what to do and where to go, that's much murkier. They're not so clear. And the word socialism isn't an unmitigated logical alternative, not at all. They keeping that at a distance too, most of them. Well, then where are we going to go is the question that's behind everyone's head, in a sense. It's in their mind. If capitalism isn't so good, where do we go? And I wanted to take just a couple of minutes to respond to that. Of course, you could go, and my guess is we will be seeing that, you could go again in the direction that socialists took in the 19th and 20th centuries, when socialism in its modern form emerged. And for those people, the alternative to capitalism was pretty clearly worked out after a while. Where capitalism was private enterprises and markets, socialism was public enterprises and government planning. The businesses would be run by the government, not by private enterprises. And where private enterprises ran the businesses for their own profit, the government, the idea was, would run it for the benefit of all the people. And where the market kind of pandered to people who had money, planning would distribute goods and services more on the basis of some notion of social need. And socialism was therefore replacing private property with public property and markets with planning. And you could see that they believed that because in the Soviet Revolution of 1917, in the Chinese Revolution 1949, in the Cuban, in the Vietnamese, that's what they did. They took large portions of private enterprise and made them governmental, and they instituted a big planning apparatus to organize who got what, which is why education, medical care, and so on were distributed to everybody. It wasn't a matter of markets anymore. You didn't get the I mean, I know this will come as a surprise to you in America, but you didn't get medical care according to how much money you had. You got medical care because you were a human being. End of story. Okay, that socialism put an awful lot of power in the hands of the government. The government would become the owner-operator of the enterprises, and the government would plan the distribution of everything that was produced. Well, that is giving an awful lot of power to a government. And that didn't work out so well. I mean, it worked well in terms of economic development. And that was a major goal because countries like Russia and China and Vietnam and Cuba were extremely poor. When they made their revolutions, these were countries among the poorest in the world. And in a very short time, they became much less poor. I know for many in America, it's always hard, given the Cold War, to wrap your head around it. But let me just remind you of some numbers. In 1917, when the Russians made their revolution, over 90% of the people in Russia were illiterate. Couldn't read or write, lived in rural areas without roads, without electricity. You have to get it. It's the most backward country in Europe at the time. In 1917, they then went through the following experiences, basically. They lost World War I. They had a revolution. The revolution was followed, that's in 1917, in 1918, by a civil war. The country split and had a civil war, and during the Civil War, 4 countries in the world invaded the new little Soviet Union with military troops. 4 countries did that. Britain, France, Japan, and the United States. 10,000 American troops landed in Russia to crush the new regime. Little fact for you to think about. No Russian troops ever came here, but our troops went there. Might make a bit more sense why they're afraid of us more than we really are of them. That's the history. Okay? Then they had an agrarian transformation, the collectivization of agriculture. Then they were the biggest loser of people and property in World War II. So this was a very poor country afflicted by 2 world wars, a civil war, a foreign invasion. I mean, for them to be able to say in the 1970s that they had become the second superpower after the United States is an achievement the world has very rarely seen. In fact, the only major country in the world to achieve an economic growth as spectacular as what the Soviet Union achieved is the People's Republic of China, which in the last 20 years has basically done the same thing, but without revolutions and wars. They didn't have that. They made a strategic decision to become the producer of goods for the world, which is why most of your underpants come from China. Okay, and so does your toaster and more of the components of your car and the components of your iPad or whatever it is that you have that's an object. So the communist or socialism that they did, this government taking over everything, was very successful as an economic growth engine, which is one of the reasons so many countries around the world are attracted to it. But it also put so much power in the government that if you got people in the government who had disagreements with the mass of people, they could, and they did, use that power in undemocratic, dictatorial ways, which the enemies of socialism made a big thing of, for understandable reasons, leading an awful lot of people not to want to go in that direction. Even if they're displeased with capitalism, reproducing what happened there is not the attractive option. Well, then, the problem is, and you see that everywhere in the world, where are people, the growing number of people, dissatisfied, unhappy with capitalism? Where are they going to go? What are they going to do? What is the next place to go? Or do we have to resign ourselves, like Mrs. Pelosi, to saying, capitalism? If you actually read her statement, she began distinguishing nice capitalism from not nice capitalism. No, she meant that. Capitalism that isn't as oppressive. She was willing to say that capitalism in the United States today has produced great inequality. Give her that. She saw that, and she didn't like that. She wanted a better capitalism that didn't do that. So she wants to hold on to capitalism, but she's excited about better and worse capitalisms. But a growing number of people, particularly young ones, they don't want to go there. They don't want this system. They want something else. All right. The point then is, what might that other thing be? And one way to get at it is to ask or to recognize that what was done in the 19th and 20th century was, in a sense, the first massive effort to go beyond capitalism. Hadn't been done before. So it turns out they did some things well and other things not so well. They made some successes, they had some failures. There are lessons we need to learn what to do, and there are lessons we need to learn what not to do from what happened. Well, one of the things they didn't do was to transform the workplace. They were so busy moving from private to public, from market to plan, that the transformation of the workplace, where we as adults spend most of our lives, 5 days a week, 9 to 5, we work. And that experience, how we interact with one another, how we feel about it, what it does to us, is central to a better society if there's going to be one. So out of that comes, slowly and painfully, a recognition that transforming the workplace may well be the number one focus for a socialism of the 21st century. It is going to have to do what the earlier socialisms didn't do. In the hope that if the mass of people become the owners and operators of their workplaces, take control of the workplace, they will have the wealth, the resources, to not give over any excess power to any government anymore. That the very way that this government is beholden to capitalists, and even a casual look at Mr. Trump's cabinet can give you a good glimpse into that, then we can imagine what a government would be like if it was beholden to enterprises that were in fact owned and operated democratically by the workers in a society. And our interest in worker cooperatives and the cooperative movement comes out of this notion that in that movement lie the seeds of a way to get to a better system that learns from the first efforts that were successful and unsuccessful, charts a new direction, and thereby gives the human race a place to try to go as the difficulties of this system get worse and worse, which I do have to tell you, much as I wish I didn't, as a professional economist, is what's going to happen. It's already happening, and part of our work here every month is, unfortunately, to document it. Okay, so in that framework, I look for and like to report to you when these things happen. So I was very surprised to learn recently, and one of you sent this to me, so I appreciate those of you who send me material, that in Spremberg, S-P-R-E-M, Spremberg, in the state of Brandenburg, that's part of Germany, a local hospital has been taken over by its workers and has been for some years now, and is producing absolutely remarkable results and getting a lot of attention, which is how it came to the attention of one of you who brought it to my attention. The majority of the shares, it's a shareholding hospital, are owned by the workers who are there, and they therefore make all the basic policies. So it's a worker-run hospital. I mention that to you because mostly when I talk about co-ops, I'm talking about companies that produce goods and services. Some of you have asked me, well, could that apply also to institutions that don't work that way? And the answer is not only it could, it already does. And this is a very interesting example. Any of you interested in details can see this here. Another example I learned about is Japan. Japan has arguably more of a cooperative sector than any Western country. I used to mention Italy, which is quite well developed as a co-op. There are parts of Italy where half the local economy is cooperatives. Emilia-Romagna, for some of you who know, one of the states in Italy, one of the provinces is the state. Roughly 40% of the economy in that area is co-ops. But in Japan, the statistics are really extraordinary. Give you an example. Japan's Consumer Cooperative Union, commonly referred to as the co-op in Japan, provides an enormous range of goods and services. It has 28 million members. It counts for membership is 37% of Japanese households are members of these co-ops. They do many billions of dollars worth of business every year. They are a mainstay. They have associated with them large numbers of cooperative banks that are also owned and operated by the people who have accounts in them. The whole cooperative sector in Japan is decades ahead of what it was here. And the irony is that most of those co-ops were actually created in the 1950s under the occupation of Japan by the United States after World War II. Remember General MacArthur? Some of you have read the history. Well, he had American farming interests who came out of America's co-ops, which were once very strong, and they wanted to implant that because they believed that co-ops was a more secure way to ground, you'll love this, democracy in Japan than letting them become private capitalist enterprises. So they took off in Japan and they died here. That's called the irony of history. But the Japanese are very deeply committed. The only challenge to this co-op right now is another company that has captured their way of organizing vast deliveries of goods and services. Most of what this co-op does is deliver food and other items to the Japanese. They like delivery. They've liked it for decades. The company that threatens them now, Amazon. And they are now fighting to hold on to their dominant position and keep Amazon at bay.